The year is 1688, and the air in the royal apartments of Whitehall Palace hangs heavy and still, thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood smoke. Outside, a perpetual drizzle coats London in a glistening silver sheen, but inside, the atmosphere is far more oppressive. You can hear the soft scuff of silk slippers on polished floors, the distant echo of a sentry's footsteps, and the low, murmuring whispers that seem to cling to the tapestries on the walls. King James II of England, Scotland, and Ireland sits in a high-backed chair, the firelight glinting off the rich embroidery of his waistcoat. His face, etched with a certain grim weariness, is turned toward a window, but his gaze seems fixed on something far away, something in the future he cannot quite control. He hears the hushed conversations in the antechambers, the subtle coughs and throat clearings of courtiers who suddenly find urgent business elsewhere when his eyes meet theirs. They talk of the king's faith, of his unwavering loyalty to the Roman Catholic Church in a land that has, for generations, been fiercely Protestant. They speak of his new decrees, his attempts to suspend laws that prevent Catholics from holding public office, to fill government and military positions with men loyal to him, not to their faith or their parliament. This slow, creeping unease had been building for years, a quiet friction between a king who believed in the divine right of monarchs to rule as they saw fit, and a people who were increasingly convinced their rights were just as divine, if not more so. The English had been through this before, of course. Just a few decades earlier, they had beheaded a king, James's own father, Charles III, for much the same stubbornness. A civil war had torn the country apart, and now the specter of that conflict loomed once again, a ghost in the halls of power, a collective memory that made every whispered word, every sudden silence feel like a threat. James, a man who saw compromise as a weakness, simply could not understand their fear. He saw a people shackled by irrational prejudice, a parliament that sought to usurp the authority God had granted him. Did you know that James's own brother, the beloved King Charles II, had managed this tension with a casual, almost roguish charm, but James possessed none of that relaxed pragmatism? He was a man of firm belief, and in a time of deep religious division, a firm belief was often a recipe for disaster. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The problem for many was not just James himself. It was the question of what would happen after him. James's heir was his daughter, Mary, a devout Protestant married to William of Orange, the powerful leader of the Netherlands. They were the perfect, reassuring alternative. Everyone knew that a few more years of James's rule, and then the throne would pass to a Protestant, and the great drama would be over. The tension would dissipate like morning mist. But then, on a rainy June day in 1688, the unexpected happened. A child was born to King James and his second wife, Mary of Modena, a son, James Francis as Edward Stuart. And just like that, the entire succession plan was thrown into chaos. This wasn't just another child, this was a Catholic son, a new heir who would take precedence over his Protestant sisters. The specter of a permanent Catholic dynasty settled over the land like a suffocating blanket. The hushed whispers grew louder, more frantic. The tension was no longer a matter of waiting out an old king, but of facing a future ruled by the very faith they feared. The quiet anxiety of the court was spreading like a ripple across the vast, intricate web of English society. The bishops in their cathedrals, the merchants in their bustling coffee houses, the country squires on their sprawling estates, all felt the chill. The king's policies seemed designed to provoke. He had issued a declaration of indulgence, a grand proclamation meant to grant religious freedom to Catholics and Protestant dissenters alike. On the surface, it sounded benevolent, a step toward tolerance, but it was seen as a thinly veiled attack on the established Anglican Church, an attempt to bypass Parliament and rule by royal decree. When he ordered the clergy to read the declaration aloud from their pulpits, it was the final straw. 7 bishops, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, refused. They were arrested and put on trial for seditious libel. This single act, putting men of God on trial for refusing to defy their conscience, unified public opinion against the king in a way nothing else had. The trial became a national spectacle, a moral referendum on James's rule. When the jury returned a verdict of not guilty, the streets of London erupted in cheers. People lit bonfires and toasted the bishop's freedom. Even the soldiers in the royal army joined in the celebrations, a clear sign that the king had lost the loyalty of his own armed forces. It was in this moment, in the dead of the English summer, that a different kind of plot began to take shape, not in the public square, but in the dark, wood-paneled rooms of noblemen. The people watching this drama unfold were the ones who truly understood the gravity of the situation. For them, it was a battle for the very soul of the nation, for the delicate balance of power that had been so hard won. The king's actions, no matter how he justified them, were a direct assault on the principles of a mixed government, where the power of the monarch was tempered by the wisdom of Parliament. He was reaching for an absolute power that they believed had been discarded with the blood of his father. His son's birth wasn't just a happy event for a royal family, it was a political earthquake. It meant the fight wouldn't end with James's death. It meant it was only just beginning. And in this moment of collective apprehension, a new kind of idea began to take root, a dangerous one. Perhaps the solution was not to wait and see, but to act. Perhaps the future of England was no longer a matter of succession, but of salvation. The stage was set, the characters were in place, and the first act was drawing to a close, a tense prologue to a drama that would change everything. The question was, who would write the next scene? The answer to who would write the next scene was already being whispered in hushed tones, carried on the very same winds that blew across the North Sea. In the Netherlands, William of Orange, Prince of the House of Orange-Nassau and Stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, was not merely a passive observer of English events. He was a central figure in a much larger European chess game. He was the chief opponent of King Louis XIII of France, a monarch with an almost insatiable appetite for expansion and glory. Louis, the Sun King, represented everything William detested: absolutism, Catholicism, and a military might that threatened to swallow up his small Protestant nation. For years, William had watched with growing concern as James II, his father-in-law, grew closer to Louis XIV, a dangerous alignment that could one day see England and France as allies against the Dutch. The birth of James's Catholic son wasn't just a shock to the English, it was a strategic nightmare for William. It meant the permanent loss of a potential English alliance, a crucial piece in his anti-French puzzle. It was this potent mixture of personal interest, dynastic concern, and strategic necessity that made William receptive to the secret plea that arrived on his shores. The letter, known to history as the Invitation of the Seven, was a document of extraordinary risk and ambition. It was signed by 7 prominent English noblemen, including the Earl of Danby, a former chief minister of Charles II, and Henry Compton, the Bishop of London. They spoke not for the whole nation, but for a powerful and influential cross-section of the English elite, men who feared for their faith, their property, and the very constitution of their country. They painted a picture of a nation teetering on the brink of revolt, of a people who would welcome a deliverer. They assured William that 19 parts of 20 of the people throughout the kingdom were dissatisfied with the current state of affairs and would flock to his standard. It was, of course, a wild exaggeration, a bit of political salesmanship, but it was enough. The message was clear. If William came, he would not be met with resistance, but with open arms. They even offered a curious bit of legal and moral cover, suggesting that he was not coming to invade, but to protect the rights of his wife, Princess Mary, and her claim to the throne. William was a cautious and calculating man, not prone to rash decisions. He spent the summer of 1688 meticulously planning. His preparations were a masterclass in covert diplomacy and military logistics. He needed to raise an army and a fleet, but he had to do it without alarming his powerful enemies, particularly Louis XIV. He told his own people, the Dutch, that the force was for defense against France. He told the European powers that it was a simple training exercise. Meanwhile, his agents were busy across the continent, spreading rumors, securing loans, and hiring mercenaries. He gathered a diverse force of Dutch, German, and French Protestant soldiers, a formidable army of around 15,000 men. The fleet he assembled was equally impressive, consisting of hundreds of ships, not just warships, but transports, supply ships, and even smaller vessels to navigate the English coastline. The scale of the operation was immense, a logistical marvel that would have been impossible without the full support of the Dutch government and financiers. What's fascinating is the diplomatic dance William performed with Louis XIV. Louis was busy with his own plans to attack German territories, and he underestimated William's intentions, believing the invasion of England was a bluff or a secondary concern. French diplomats even warned James II that William was preparing to invade, but James, perhaps blinded by a certain kind of royal arrogance, dismissed the warnings as part of a French scheme. He believed that no son-in-law would ever betray his own wife's father. This was, of course, a rather large historical miscalculation. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV was simply overconfident or if he was genuinely tricked by William's clever misdirection, but the result was the same. Louis committed his forces elsewhere, leaving England exposed and William's path clear. As autumn turned to winter, the preparations in the Netherlands were impossible to hide. The great fleet, bristling with guns and filled with men, was a sight to behold. On the flag of William's flagship, the Den Briel, a powerful message was emblazoned for all to see. for the Protestant religion and the liberties of England. It was a brilliant piece of public relations. He wasn't coming for power. He was coming for principles. He was not a conqueror, but a champion of Protestantism and a defender of English rights. This image, cultivated so carefully, would prove to be his most potent weapon. Back in England, the news of the impending invasion spread like wildfire. James, finally understanding the peril, scrambled to respond. He tried to backtrack on some of his most unpopular policies, restoring officials he had dismissed, making concessions to the Anglican Church. But it was far too late. His panicked gestures were seen not as genuine change of heart, but as the desperate acts of a cornered king. The trust was gone. The stage was now set for an event that in its peaceful nature would be utterly unique. The invasion wasn't a secret, and it wasn't a surprise. Everyone in Europe knew it was coming. It was a slow-motion political and military drama unfolding in plain sight. William's army was ready, his fleet was prepared, and the wind, a crucial and unpredictable factor in any naval operation, was all that was missing. It was a waiting game. The fate of England hung in the balance, suspended over the churning waters of the English Channel. For all his military might, William was ultimately at the mercy of the weather. And as we will see, a particularly fortunate gust of air would soon change the course of history. It's like waiting for a taxi, but the taxi is a massive armada, and your ride is to take over a country. It must have been a very long wait. The tension would have been something you could feel in your bones, a low hum of anticipation that filled the air from The Hague to Whitehall. The question was, when would that fateful wind finally blow? The answer to that question of the wind arrived in the early days of November. It was not a gentle breeze, but a powerful, steady gale, a storm that seemed to have been sent by Providence itself. This was the Protestant wind, as it would be dubbed by the grateful. It was a weather system so perfectly timed and so powerful that it almost seemed too good to be true. On the morning of November 31st, William's massive fleet, a grand procession of ships stretching for miles across the horizon, set sail from the Dutch port of Hellevoetsluis. King James II's own naval fleet, under the command of Lord Dartmouth, was waiting in the Thames estuary. The plan was to intercept William's ships, to engage them in a great naval battle before they could land their men. But the Protestant wind was so fierce that it held Dartmouth's fleet in the Thames. The wind was coming from the east, and it was impossible for the English ships to sail against it. They were simply pinned down, helpless spectators to the unfolding drama. Meanwhile, the very same wind filled the sails of William's ships, pushing them effortlessly across the English Channel. The journey itself was a magnificent and surreal spectacle. The Armada, a veritable floating city, sailed in a precise, disciplined formation. It was a show of force designed to inspire confidence in William's supporters and to demoralize his enemies. The sight must have been extraordinary. Hundreds of ships, their sails full of the powerful wind, gliding past the English coastline. The sheer scale of it was unprecedented. Many English people, standing on the cliffs of Kent and Sussex, watched in stunned silence as the fleet passed by. They were not just watching a military operation, they were watching a historical declaration. This was not a quiet, stealthy invasion. This was an open challenge, a public show of strength that left no room for doubt about William's intentions or his resources. And for many of them, it was a moment of hope, a physical manifestation of the change they had been praying for. William's initial plan was to land in Yorkshire, in the north of England, a region with strong Protestant sympathies. But the Protestant wind, in a curious twist of fate, pushed his fleet further south than he had intended. His ships sailed past the north and the east coasts, past London, and on down to the southwest. This change of course, though accidental, would prove to be a stroke of genius. The landing site they eventually chose was Torbay in Devon. On November 5th, 1688, William's army began to disembark. The date was significant, a powerful symbol for English Protestants. It was the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot, a famous Catholic conspiracy to blow up Parliament. William, a master of political symbolism, was landing on a day that commemorated the foiling of a Catholic plot. It was another signal, loud and clear, that he was there to protect the nation from a repeat of such treachery. The landing was a model of efficiency. The vast army, with all its horses, cannons, and supplies, was brought ashore without a single mishap. They marched inland, not with the brutal haste of an invading force, but with the careful, measured pace of a procession. William issued a proclamation, which had been printed and distributed widely, reiterating his purpose. He was there, he declared, not to conquer, but to secure a free parliament, one that would right the wrongs committed by the king. He was there to protect the rights of the English people, to guarantee the Protestant religion, and to secure the succession for his wife, Mary. This message was key. He was not a foreign invader. He was a guest, invited by a substantial portion of the English elite to help them fix a broken government. He was not there to seize power, but to restore a proper constitutional balance. As William's army began its slow march towards London, something remarkable happened. The people did not resist him. Instead, they welcomed him. Local dignitaries and common folk alike came out to see him, to cheer him, and to offer him provisions. The lack of resistance was a profound testament to how deeply unpopular King James II had become. It was a silent, peaceful revolution unfolding on the ground. People were not fighting for William. They were simply not fighting for James. The country was in a state of suspended animation, a sort of collective holding of its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. There were no pitched battles, no bloody skirmishes. This was a war of nerves, and King James was losing it. He had an army, a larger army than William's, in fact, but its loyalty was questionable. He ordered his forces to march west to confront William, but as they went, the defections began, one by one, then in small groups, then in larger numbers. Officers and soldiers simply melted away, riding off to join William's banner. It was a quiet collapse, a slow-motion unraveling of royal authority. A quiet joke that made the rounds was that James's army was less an army and more a series of very well-organized resignations. This silent, almost serene progression toward revolution was its defining characteristic. It was less a war and more a political demonstration, a grand statement of a nation's will. The Protestant wind had not only landed William on English soil, it had blown away the last vestiges of James's authority. The invasion was happening, But it was not about military might. It was about moral and political legitimacy, and on that front, William was winning without even trying. The stage was set for the next, equally dramatic act, the dissolution of the king's power without a single shot fired in a major engagement. As William's processions advanced slowly, like a summer storm gathering strength, King James II's world was quietly falling apart. The defections from his army were not just a trickle, they were a flood. It began with lower-ranking officers, and then, with increasing speed, spread to the highest echelons of command. First to go was Lord Cornbury, a close associate of the king, who took his entire regiment with him. Then, a few days later, one of James's most trusted commanders, Colonel Percy Kirke, a man known for his brutality and loyalty, simply refused to obey the king's order to attack the advancing Dutch. He told the king's messenger he would rather see his own sword run through him than fight against the Protestants. It was a clear and devastating sign that James had lost the loyalty of his most crucial asset. But the most shocking betrayal was yet to come, and it was a betrayal of the most personal kind. The king's own family members were turning against him. His younger daughter, Princess Anne, and her husband, Prince George of Denmark, fled the court and joined the side of the Prince of Orange. This was a direct, public act of defiance that sent shockwaves through the royal household. Princess Anne's flight was particularly symbolic and heartbreaking for the king. As she was leaving, she wrote a letter to her father explaining her actions. She said she had been driven to this point by her conscience, a phrase that must have stung the king with its quiet accusation. For the king, it was a profound personal blow, a sign that the political earthquake was now fracturing his own family. The rumor mill, of course, went into overdrive, with many whispering that even the Queen was plotting with the Dutch. This was not true, but it highlighted the deep sense of paranoia and mistrust that now defined the court. The defection of John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, was another nail in the coffin. Churchill was an ambitious and brilliant military commander, one of James's favorites, and a man who owed his career to the king. Yet he, too, abandoned his post and joined William. James's court was no longer a place of power. It was a ghost town of empty rooms and worried faces. The advisors who remained were either too afraid or too loyal to offer any meaningful counsel, while the king himself oscillated between fits of rage and moments of listless despair. He had a larger army, but he couldn't trust it. He had a kingdom, but it was slipping through his fingers. He had a family, but they were abandoning him. Meanwhile, William's march continued, a calm and orderly progression. He took his time, allowing the political drama to play out in London and at James's court. He knew that every day that passed without a fight was a day gained. The lack of a major military confrontation meant that the transition would be seen as a national consensus, not as a bloody conquest. This was a crucial distinction. The revolution was being won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the English people, one defection and one proclamation at a time. The king's authority was not being broken, it was simply evaporating. This slow-motion collapse was a key characteristic of the Glorious Revolution. It was a revolution won by walking, by waiting, and by the strategic use of political optics. The English people, for their part, were watching this drama with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The specter of civil war, with its grim memories of Oliver Cromwell and the regicide of King Charles I, had loomed large. Everyone had feared a repeat, but now it seemed a different kind of history was being written, one where the old order was dismantled not with bloodshed, but with quiet, dignified resistance. Local lords and gentry were meeting with William, pledging their support, not out of a love for the Dutch prince, but out of a fear of the Catholic king. They were making a very pragmatic political calculation. Better to support a foreign Protestant prince who promised to respect their rights than to support an English Catholic king who seemed hell-bent on destroying them. James, in a final desperate act, tried to rally the remnants of his forces at Salisbury. He had the opportunity to engage William's army, to fight for his throne, but his will was gone. The defections and betrayals had broken him. He was a man without a country, even though he was standing in the middle of it. The constant fear of assassination, of betrayal by his own men, and the psychological toll of his family's abandonment had rendered him indecisive and weak. He eventually decided against a battle and ordered his troops to retreat back to London. This retreat was the final and most devastating blow to his authority. It was a public admission that he had lost. His flight from the front was the final proof that he had abdicated his role as a king and a leader. As William's forces moved ever closer, London itself became a stage for political theater and a hotbed of quiet panic. The city was gripped by a tense, nervous anticipation. The coffee houses, those great hubs of political gossip, were abuzz with rumors of defections and the king's unraveling authority. On the surface, daily life continued, but beneath it, the social and political fabric was stretched taut, ready to snap. The citizens of London, a mix of wealthy merchants, skilled craftsmen, and common laborers, watched the unfolding events with a mixture of fear and hope. They had been the victims of royal overreach for years, and now they were witness to its very public and very slow demise. They feared the chaos of a civil war, but they also secretly cheered the downfall of a king who seemed to hold their liberties in such low regard. The city was holding its breath. Inside Whitehall Palace, King James II was a man in the throes of a mental and emotional collapse. He had retreated from Salisbury, his royal dignity in tatters, his once formidable will now broken. He had returned to London to find a capital on the verge of revolt. His court was empty, his advisors had fled, and the loyalty of his own people was a thing of the past. In a final, desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control, he sent 3 of his most trusted men, the Marquis of Halifax, the Earl of Nottingham, and Lord Godolphin, to negotiate with William. The envoys were to present William with the offer of a free parliament and a general pardon for those who had supported his invasion. But these were empty gestures, too little, too late. William, a man of cold pragmatism, simply listened to their proposals, offering nothing in return. He knew the balance of power had shifted completely. He no longer needed to negotiate. He simply needed to wait. It was during this time that a powerful anti-Catholic sentiment, which had been simmering for years, boiled over. The people of London, with the king's authority gone, took matters into their own hands. Mobs roamed the streets, targeting Catholic chapels and homes, breaking windows and burning effigies. It was a frightening and chaotic spectacle, a glimpse into the kind of violence the Glorious Revolution had, for the most part, managed to avoid. The most dramatic incident was the attack on the Spanish ambassador's chapel, a symbol of James's foreign and Catholic alliances. The mob, angry and fearless, ransacked the building, destroying icons and statues. This chaos, which James was powerless to stop, was a clear signal that his time was truly at an end. His police force and soldiers, a reflection of the larger national mood, either stood by and watched, or, in some cases, joined in the destruction. A mainstream historical fact is that the London mob, in a particularly dramatic act of defiance, seized the Lord Chancellor, George Jeffreys, a notorious judge who had presided over many of James's most controversial trials. They dragged him through the streets, dressed in a disguise, and were on the verge of lynching him before he was rescued and put in the Tower of London for his own protection. This was no longer just a political crisis. It was a total breakdown of law and order, and the king himself was powerless to stop it. Faced with this complete loss of control, James made the only decision he felt was left to him. He would flee. On December 11th, in the dead of night, he slipped out of Whitehall Palace. He was accompanied by his wife, Queen Mary, and their infant son, the young Prince of Wales, whose birth had sparked this whole ordeal. He threw the great seal of the realm, the symbol of his authority, into the River Thames, a final symbolic act of defiance, and a gesture meant to leave the kingdom in chaos. They took a small boat and attempted to sail to France. This was not a grand escape, but a sad and desperate flight. He was a king running away from his own people. His act of abandonment was a profound and powerful moment. For Parliament and for the nation, his flight was not seen as an escape, but as an abdication. By leaving the throne vacant, he had, in effect, solved the constitutional crisis for them. A king who had run away was no longer a king. However, the flight did not go as planned. James was recognized by a group of fishermen in Kent, who, not knowing what to do with a captured king, simply detained him. The news of his capture spread quickly, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the whole crisis might have a very messy ending. But William of Orange, who was still marching slowly towards London, knew a direct confrontation with the king would ruin the peaceful nature of his glorious revolution. He did not want to be seen as a regicide or a usurper, but as a liberator. And so, he quietly arranged for James to be rescued and escorted back to London. It was a brilliant move. He made it clear to the king that he was free to go, that he should, in fact, go. And so, on a quiet night, William arranged for James to be taken to Rochester, a port city from which he could make a second, more successful escape to France. This second and final flight was a quiet conclusion to a very loud and very public fall from power. With James II finally and successfully gone from English soil, the path was clear. William of Orange, and the Dutch prince who had arrived as a liberator, made his entry into London not as a conquering hero, but as a quiet, unassuming statesman. On December 18, 1688, William rode through the city to a reception that was both joyous and a little subdued. There were no great parades or military displays. The atmosphere was one of palpable relief. The citizens had feared a civil war, a repeat of the bloody conflicts of their parents' and grandparents' generations. Instead, they had a peaceful, if strange, transfer of power. William, dressed in a simple riding coat, rode straight to St. James's Palace, where he set up his temporary court. The feeling was that the crisis was over, and now it was time for the long, complex work of putting the country back together. It's a bit like when you're moving house, and you've finally gotten all the boxes inside. The hard part is over, but the real work of unpacking has just begun. William's first task was to establish the legal and political framework for his new position. He did not claim the throne by right of conquest. Such a claim would have been seen as an act of tyranny and would have undone all the careful political messaging of his invasion. Instead, he chose to rely on the legal authority of the English people, represented by their parliament. He immediately summoned a meeting of all the members of Parliament who had served in the last reign of Charles II, along with the aldermen of London and other notables. This assembly, though not a legally constituted parliament, was a temporary body that would serve as the voice of the nation. They met at Westminster and were known as the Convention Parliament. This was a crucial step. By calling this body into being, William was signaling that he respected the legal traditions of the English Constitution and that he would not rule by force alone. The Convention Parliament was a fascinating body. It was a mix of Whigs and Tories, the two great political factions of the time. The Whigs, who had long opposed James's Catholic policies, were eager to declare the throne vacant and offer it to William and Mary. They believed that a monarch's power was conditional and that James, by his actions, had forfeited his right to rule. The Tories, on the other hand, were in a more difficult position. They were, in theory, devoted to the principle of divine right monarchy and the idea of a continuous hereditary succession. For them, simply declaring the throne vacant was a dangerous and revolutionary act that could set a precedent for future rebellions. They wanted to find a way to preserve the monarchy without bringing James back. They came up with a variety of legalistic arguments, including the idea of a regency, where William would rule in James's name. This, of course, was an idea that held no appeal for William. He had not gone to all this trouble to become a mere placeholder for his father-in-law. The debates within the Convention Parliament were long and often heated. The Whigs, led by figures like John Hampden, a descendant of the famous parliamentarian from the English Civil War, argued that James's flight was a clear act of abdication. They pointed to the fact that he had thrown the Great Seal into the river as a symbol of his abandonment of the kingdom. The Tories, meanwhile, tried to find a less revolutionary solution. Historians still argue whether the Tories' reluctance was driven more by genuine principle or by a more pragmatic fear of what a truly revolutionary settlement would mean for the future of the English monarchy. But William was a shrewd politician. He made it clear to both sides that he would not accept the title of regent and that he had no intention of ruling alongside his wife, Mary, as a subordinate. If they wanted him to rule, they would have to offer him the throne as a full, equal partner. Mary, for her part, also made it clear that she would not reign alone and that her loyalty was to her husband. This put the Convention Parliament in a difficult position. They had a problem, and William had presented them with the only possible solution. Ultimately, the political reality of the situation won out over abstract legal principles. The Tories, seeing no other option, were forced to compromise. On January 28, 1689, the House of Commons passed a resolution stating that King James II, having withdrawn himself out of the kingdom, had abdicated the government and that the throne was now thereby vacant. The House of Lords, after a week of intense debate, finally agreed. It was a momentous decision. This was a mainstream historical fact, a legal and constitutional milestone. For the first time, Parliament had effectively removed a king and declared the throne to be vacant. It was a quiet act, a piece of political paperwork, but it was a revolutionary moment that changed the course of English history forever. The stage was now set for the next step, the crafting of the document that would define the new relationship between the Crown and Parliament. With the throne declared vacant, the Convention Parliament had a new and even more significant task before them, to define the terms under which the new monarchs, William and Mary, would rule. The era of the unconditional, divinely appointed monarch was over. The Whigs and Tories, now united in their goal to prevent a repeat of James II's abuses, began to draft a list of grievances and demands. This was to be the condition for the crown being offered. This document was the Declaration of Rights, a text that was not just a historical recap of James's failings, but a foundational blueprint for a new constitutional monarchy. It was a pivotal moment in English history, a quiet, almost bureaucratic revolution where ideas were put into law. The Declaration of Rights laid out in stark, clear language all the ways in which King James II had violated the laws and liberties of the kingdom. It was a long list, a litany of royal sins. It detailed the king's attempts to suspend laws without Parliament's consent, his raising of taxes without parliamentary approval, his maintenance of a standing army in peacetime, and his interference with the independence of the judiciary. The document didn't just list these abuses, it declared them illegal. For example, it stated that the king's power to dispense with or suspend laws was now unequivocally illegal. It also condemned the levying of money by the crown without a parliamentary grant and the raising of an army in peacetime without Parliament's consent. This was a massive shift in power, a formal transfer of authority from the monarch to the elected representatives of the people. It was a moment of truth, a kind of constitutional checkmate, where the king's power was not just challenged, but permanently limited. The declaration went beyond simply criticizing the past. It looked to the future. It affirmed a number of key rights for English subjects, rights that would become the cornerstone of a new form of government. It guaranteed the right of Protestants to bear arms for their defense. It guaranteed the freedom of speech and debate in Parliament, a crucial protection for a government that now depended on open discussion and negotiation. It demanded frequent parliaments, a rule that would ensure the monarch could not simply rule without consulting the people's representatives. It also addressed the issue of succession, a matter that had been at the heart of the crisis. It explicitly excluded Catholics from inheriting the throne, a line of succession that has been in place with some modifications to this very day. Historians still argue whether the Declaration was a truly revolutionary document or if it was simply a conservative reaffirmation of existing English liberties, but its impact was undeniable. It codified principles that had until then been matters of custom or unwritten law, making them explicit and legally binding. On February 13th, 1689, a formal delegation from the Convention Parliament, led by the Marquess of Halifax, a man who had been a key figure in the negotiations, went to Whitehall Palace to present the Declaration of Rights to William and Mary. The moment was heavy with historical significance. The future of the nation, the very shape of its government, was about to be decided. William and Mary stood on the throne, symbols of a new beginning, as Halifax read the long document aloud. He started with the list of James's offenses, a catalogue of his constitutional sins, and then read the new conditions for their reign. When he was finished, he asked if they would accept the crown on these terms. William, with Mary by his side, gave his assent. He said that he accepted the crown with the conditions laid out in the Declaration. It was a powerful, symbolic moment. William was not taking the throne as a right. He was accepting it as a responsibility, a contract with the English people, a contract that was now in writing. This was a mainstream historical fact, a moment in which the divine right of kings was replaced by the contractual right of the people. The power of the crown was no longer absolute. It was a partnership with Parliament. This was the defining achievement of the Glorious Revolution. It was not just about changing the king, but about fundamentally changing the nature of kingship itself. The Declaration of Rights was the legal instrument of that change. It transformed the nation from an absolute monarchy into a constitutional one, and while its language was specific to the problems of the day, its principles would have a long and lasting legacy, not just in England, but across the world, influencing everything from the American Constitution to the development of modern democratic states. The Revolution was no longer just an event. It was now a legal settlement, a new and permanent foundation for the English government. The Declaration of Rights was a powerful document, but it was just that, a declaration. To make its principles legally binding and permanent, it had to be passed into law. And so, the Convention Parliament set about turning this statement of intent into a formal act of Parliament. This crucial step transformed the theoretical revolution into a concrete legal reality. On December 16th, 1689, the Declaration of Rights was officially enacted as the Bill of Rights. This was the crowning achievement of the Glorious Revolution, a moment that formally enshrined the new power dynamics of the English government. It was no longer a question of a king making a promise. It was a matter of law. The Bill of Rights, with its carefully worded clauses, became the foundation of the English constitutional monarchy. The Bill of Rights reiterated the key points from the Declaration, but with the force of law. It explicitly forbade the monarch from levying taxes without parliamentary approval. It prohibited the crown from keeping a standing army during peacetime without the consent of Parliament. It affirmed the right of subjects to petition the king without fear of prosecution. Most importantly, it established the principle of parliamentary supremacy, stating that the monarch could not suspend or dispense with laws, as James II had attempted to do. This simple phrase was revolutionary in its implication. It meant that the king was not above the law, but subject to it, just like any other citizen. This was a profound and permanent shift in the English political landscape. Another major achievement of the bill was its guarantee of free and fair elections for Parliament, a crucial step toward a more representative government. It also guaranteed the right to a jury trial for all citizens and prohibited cruel and unusual punishments, principles that would later be enshrined in other constitutional documents around the world. The bill also addressed the succession once more, reinforcing the exclusion of Catholics from the throne. It stated that no person who shall profess the popish religion or shall marry a papist would be able to inherit the crown. This provision was a direct response to the birth of James II's Catholic son and the subsequent fear of a Catholic dynasty. It was a clear and unequivocal statement that the Protestant faith was now irrevocably linked to the English monarchy. With the Bill of Rights passed, the Convention Parliament was ready to proceed with the coronation. The legal and moral grounds for a new monarchy had been established. On April 11th, 1689, William and Mary were officially crowned as joint monarchs of England, Scotland, and Ireland at Westminster Abbey. This was not a typical coronation. For the first time, the monarch's power was not granted by God alone, but also by the will of Parliament. The coronation oath itself was modified to reflect this new reality. The new monarchs swore to govern according to the statutes in Parliament agreed upon, a phrase that, in a few simple words, summarized the entire political transformation of the previous 6 months. This was a mainstream historical fact, a moment of profound symbolism. William and Mary were not just inheriting a throne, they were accepting a new kind of power, a power that was conditional and limited by the rule of law. Their joint rule was a unique arrangement. Mary was the primary heir, but William's political and military power was what had made the revolution possible. The solution was to make them co-monarchs, with William holding the ultimate executive power, a deal that Mary herself had insisted upon. This partnership symbolized the new balance of power. William, the strong, decisive military leader, and Mary, the link to the traditional line of succession. This was a marriage of convenience, both politically and personally, that served to stabilize a kingdom that had been on the verge of chaos. Their reign would be a test of this new constitutional experiment, a delicate balancing act between royal prerogative and parliamentary authority. The Bill of Rights, along with the Declaration of Rights that preceded it, had a profound and lasting impact. It was a model for future constitutional documents and a source of inspiration for political thinkers around the world. For the English, it was a moment of national pride, a testament to their ability to resolve a deep political crisis without the large-scale bloodshed of a civil war. It was, in many ways, the final act of a long-running play about power, religion, and the soul of the nation, and it ended with a new script being written, a script that would be used by future generations. With the constitutional settlement firmly in place, it was time for the new monarchs to face the messy and often bloody aftermath of their peaceful revolution. The Bill of Rights had been a masterpiece of political negotiation in England, but its effects were not felt equally across the entire kingdom. The Glorious Revolution was a very English affair, and it was met with fierce resistance in Ireland, a country where the deposed James II had a large and powerful base of support. Ireland was a powder keg of religious and political tensions, and James, a Catholic king with Catholic allies in the country, saw it as his best chance to reclaim his throne. This Irish counter-revolution would become a central feature of the early years of William and Mary's reign. James II landed in Ireland in March 1689, a mere 2 months after William and Mary were offered the throne. He was met with a jubilant welcome from the native Irish population and the Catholic community. For them, James was not a deposed tyrant, but a liberator, a king who had promised them an end to the brutal Protestant oppression they had suffered under English rule. He arrived with French troops and money, a clear sign that this was not just an Irish revolt, but a proxy war with his great enemy, Louis XIII. The Irish Parliament, which was now dominated by Catholics, immediately passed a series of laws to reverse the land settlements that had given so much Irish land to Protestant settlers. They declared their loyalty to James and began to raise a massive army. For the Protestants in Ireland, a minority who held most of the land and power, this was a terrifying turn of events. They were now surrounded by a hostile Catholic majority, and their lives and property were at risk. The center of this Irish resistance was the city of Derry, a Protestant stronghold in the north of the country. The city was a symbol of Protestant defiance and a critical strategic point. James's forces, a combination of Irish and French troops, laid siege to the city in April 1689. This siege was not a quick affair. It was a long, brutal, and grueling ordeal that would last for 105 days. The city's defenders, a mix of local militia and a small number of professional soldiers, were vastly outnumbered. They were short on food, supplies, and morale. Conditions inside the city walls were horrific. People starved, disease ran rampant, and the constant bombardment from James's cannons took a heavy toll. Despite this, the city held on, a testament to the stubborn resilience of its defenders. The siege of Derry was not just a military event, it was a deeply symbolic one. For the Protestants, it was a test of their faith and their will to survive. They refused to surrender, believing that to do so would mean not just defeat, but the end of their way of life. William, meanwhile, was focused on consolidating his power in England and preparing for the larger European war against France. He understood the strategic importance of Ireland and the danger that a restored James II would pose to his new kingdom. He dispatched an army to relieve the siege of Derry, but it was not an easy task. The French navy was a constant threat, and the Irish countryside was difficult to navigate. The city was finally relieved in late July, when a small fleet of English ships managed to break through the boom, a large chain and log barrier that James's forces had placed across the River Foyle. The ships brought much-needed food and supplies, and with the relief of the city, James's forces lifted the siege. The relief of Derry was a major turning point, a powerful moment that boosted Protestant morale and sent a clear signal that William was prepared to fight for his new kingdom. The events in Ireland were a brutal and bloody reminder that the Glorious Revolution was not, in fact, bloodless for everyone. While England had a relatively peaceful transfer of power, Ireland was the stage for a vicious civil war. The conflict was not just about two rival kings. It was a deep-seated battle for land, religion, and national identity that had been festering for centuries. The Irish, known to history as Jacobites for their loyalty to James, and the Protestants, known as Williamites, were now locked in a mortal struggle. This conflict was a far cry from the polite political maneuvering in London. It was a war of desperation and survival, and its resolution would have a lasting impact on the relationship between England and Ireland for centuries to come. The stage was now set for the decisive battle that would determine the fate of both nations. The question was, where would the two kings finally meet? The Irish Civil War reached its climax in the summer of 1690. King William III, a seasoned military commander, recognized that he could not allow the Irish rebellion to fester. A successful restoration of James II in Ireland would create a dangerous second front in his war against France and would embolden his enemies at home. And so, in June 1690, William himself took command of the main Protestant army in Ireland. He was not just sending troops. He was putting his own reputation and his newly won throne on the line. He landed in Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland, with a massive army of English, Dutch, Danish, and Huguenot soldiers, a truly international force united by its opposition to both French and Catholic power. His arrival sent a clear signal to the Jacobite forces that the time for negotiation was over. James II, meanwhile, had been busy with his own military preparations. He had an army that was mostly Irish, but it was supplemented by a contingent of French regulars sent by Louis XIV. It was a motley crew, a passionate and dedicated force, but often poorly equipped and lacking the professional discipline of William's army. The two kings and their armies marched towards each other, their paths destined to converge on a small, winding river in County Meath. The place was the River Boyne, a quiet, pastoral setting that was about to become the stage for one of the most decisive battles in Irish and British history. The two armies faced each other across the river, their combined force of nearly 60,000 men a formidable sight. On the night of July 1st, 1690, the air was thick with tension, the anticipation of the coming battle so palpable you could almost feel it humming. The Battle of the Boyne, which took place on July 12th, 1690, was not a long battle, but it was a decisive one. The numbers were roughly equal, but the experience and quality of the two armies were not. William, a masterful tactician, planned a series of flanking maneuvers and a frontal assault. He was everywhere on the battlefield, a leader who was not afraid to get his hands dirty. At one point, a cannonball grazed his shoulder, and a rumor of his death spread, but he quickly dismounted and rode back to his men to prove he was still alive and in command. James, on the other hand, was an older man, a less decisive military commander, and he watched the battle from a safe distance on a hill. His actions on the day were, in the words of many historians, uninspiring. His forces fought bravely and desperately, but they were outmaneuvered and outclassed. The French regulars performed well, but the Irish forces, many of them untrained militia, were simply no match for William's professional army. The battle itself was a series of skirmishes and river crossings. William's army managed to ford the river at a number of points, outflanking James's forces and putting them to a quick and decisive rout. The casualties were surprisingly low for such a large battle, but the psychological impact was enormous. James's army broke and fled. He himself, seeing that all was lost, quickly abandoned the battlefield and fled south to Dublin and from there to France. His flight was the final act of his political career. For his Irish supporters, it was a profound act of betrayal, and it earned him the bitter nickname Seamus an Teacha, or James the Dung. The Battle of the Boyne was not just a military victory, it was a psychological one. It ended any real hope of a Stuart restoration and solidified William's position as the unquestioned King of England. A mainstream historical fact is that the Battle of the Boyne is still commemorated today by Protestants in Northern Ireland on July 12th, a day known as the 12th, which is marked by parades and celebrations. For them, it is a day that commemorates a great victory and the preservation of their religious and political liberties. For many Irish nationalists and Catholics, however, it is a day that represents a tragic defeat and the beginning of a long period of oppression under Protestant and English rule. It is a powerful reminder that the events of the Glorious Revolution, which was so peaceful in England, had a much more divisive and violent legacy in Ireland. The battle did not end the war in Ireland, but it did break the back of the Jacobite resistance. The war would drag on for another year, with a few more key battles, but the outcome was never in doubt after the Boyne. The Glorious Revolution was now, for all intents and purposes, complete. While the Battle of the Boyne was a decisive military victory for William III, it did not immediately solve all of his problems. The Glorious Revolution's peaceful transfer of power in England was a stark contrast to the difficult and often brutal reality of its acceptance in other parts of the British Isles. Scotland, for instance, had its own complex political and religious landscape, and it did not simply fall into line with the new order in London. The Scottish Parliament was a separate body, and its members were divided. Some supported William and Mary, seeing them as a Protestant bulwark against Catholicism and French power. Others remained loyal to the deposed King James II, a group known as the Jacobites, who believed in the legitimacy of the Stuart dynasty. This division would lead to a period of political turmoil and even armed conflict in the Scottish Highlands. The Scottish Convention of Estates, a body similar to the English Convention Parliament, met in March 1689 to decide the fate of the Scottish crown. After much debate, they declared that James II had, by his actions, forfeited the throne, a subtly different legal term from the English abdicated. They then offered the crown to William and Mary, who accepted under a new document, the Claim of Right. This document was the Scottish equivalent of the English Bill of Rights, and it laid out the conditions under which William and Mary would rule. It declared that no Catholic could ever be king or queen of Scotland, and affirmed the supremacy of the Scottish Parliament. However, unlike in England, this political settlement was not universally accepted. The Jacobites, led by the charismatic Viscount Dundee, known as Bonnie Dundee, refused to recognize the new monarchs. The conflict in Scotland was far from a bloodless affair. Dundee raised an army of Highlanders, men fiercely loyal to the Stuart cause, and prepared to fight for James II. The first major clash came at the Battle of Killiecrankie in July 1689. Dundee's forces, using their famous Highland charge, a terrifyingly effective tactic, routed a much larger government army. However, in the chaos of the victory, Dundee himself was killed. This was a critical moment for the Jacobite cause. The loss of their leader, a man of exceptional military talent and unwavering loyalty, was a devastating blow. The momentum of the rebellion stalled, and while it continued for a few more years, it never again posed a serious threat to William's rule. The Jacobite forces were eventually defeated at the Battle of the Haughs of Cromdale in May 1690, and the rebellion was, for the most part, over. It was a messy and often brutal affair, a clear contrast to the glorious nature of the Revolution in England. Despite the military defeat, the Scottish Jacobites remained a simmering source of unrest for decades to come, and the events of 1689 and 1690 left deep and lasting scars on Scottish society. The government in London was wary of the Highlands, a region it saw as a hotbed of rebellion and disloyalty. This suspicion would lead to a particularly dark and infamous event a few years later. The government, under William's direct authority, issued a proclamation requiring all Highland clan chiefs to swear an oath of allegiance to the new monarchs by a specific deadline. Most of the chiefs, including those who had supported James, eventually did so. But one clan, the MacDonalds of Glencoe, was late. Their chief had been delayed by a snowstorm and only managed to take the oath a few days after the deadline. This tardiness, whether accidental or intentional, was seen by the government as an act of defiance. It was a perfect excuse to make an example of them. Historians still argue whether William was fully aware of the full brutality of the plan, but he did sign the order to extirpate the clan. What happened next was a cold-blooded massacre. The government troops, under the command of Captain Robert Campbell, were billeted with the MacDonalds for 12 days, treated with the traditional Highland hospitality. Then, on a cold February morning in 1692, the soldiers rose and murdered their hosts in their beds, killing dozens of men, women, and children. The massacre of Glencoe was a brutal and shocking event, and it forever stained the reputation of the new government. It was a clear signal that the peace of the Glorious Revolution was a fragile thing, and that for those who opposed it, the consequences would be swift and merciless. It was a low point in a revolution that prided itself on its bloodless nature, a brutal reminder that a new political order is often built on the suffering of those who resist it. With the military conflicts in Ireland and Scotland largely settled, William and Mary's government was now free to address the deep-seated religious issues that had fueled the revolution. The English Bill of Rights had been a constitutional triumph, but it had not addressed the full scope of religious dissent. The Anglican Church was still the established state religion, and many non-Anglican Protestants, known as dissenters, were still subject to legal and social discrimination. They could not hold public office, attend universities, or serve in the military. This was a particular problem for William, who, as a Dutch Calvinist, was himself a dissenter from the Church of England. He had relied on the support of these groups during his invasion and he now had to deliver on his promise of greater religious freedom. The result was the Toleration Act of 1689. This landmark piece of legislation was not, in fact, a blanket grant of religious freedom. It was a compromise, a pragmatic solution to a complex problem. The act granted freedom of worship to Protestant dissenters, including Baptists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians. But it did not extend to Catholics, Jews, or atheists. Dissenters were now legally allowed to have their own places of worship and their own teachers, as long as they swore an oath of allegiance to the new monarchs. For them, it was a moment of immense relief and progress. It was a step away from the forced religious uniformity of the past and a step toward a more pluralistic society. However, the Toleration Act was a far cry from true religious equality. It did not repeal the Test Act, a law that required all public officials to take an oath and receive communion in the Church of England. This meant that while dissenters could now worship freely, they were still barred from holding public office, serving in the military, or attending the country's most prestigious universities. Historians still argue whether the Toleration Act was a genuine expression of a new liberal mindset, or simply a pragmatic political solution to a difficult problem, a way for William to placate his supporters without alienating the powerful Anglican establishment. The reality is that it was probably a bit of both. It was a forward-thinking piece of legislation that was still very much a product of its time, a time when religious tolerance was still seen as a dangerous and radical idea by many. For Catholics, the Revolution was a disaster. The Bill of Rights had already excluded them from the throne, and the new government was fiercely anti-Catholic. Laws that had been only sporadically enforced under James II were now vigorously applied. They were banned from the military and from holding public office. Their rights to inherit property were limited, and their public worship was forbidden. The fear of a Catholic popish plot had been a major factor in the public's opposition to James II, and the new government was keen to show that it would not tolerate any Catholic influence. For many Catholics, the Glorious Revolution was not glorious at all, but a period of renewed persecution and fear. The new religious settlement, therefore, created a new kind of English society. It was a society that was more tolerant than the one that came before it, but one that was still deeply and formally divided along religious lines. The Anglican Church, with its powerful political and social ties, remained the dominant force, but the dissenters were now a legally recognized and protected minority. This new religious order would have a profound and lasting impact on English life, shaping everything from politics to education to social class. The Toleration Act was a major step on a long road toward full religious freedom, and while it didn't go as far as many would have liked, it was a pivotal moment. A classic storytelling trope is that every hero's journey has a moment of compromise, and the Glorious Revolution's hero, William III, had to compromise on his own deeply held beliefs to secure the stability of his new kingdom. The act, for all its limitations, brought an end to the era of widespread religious persecution and established a new, more stable, and in many ways more modern religious landscape. With the political and religious questions largely settled, the new government of William and Mary turned its attention to a matter of pressing importance: money. The Glorious Revolution and the subsequent wars in Ireland and against France were incredibly expensive. The old system of royal finance, which relied on the monarch's personal wealth and sporadic parliamentary grants, was no longer fit for purpose. A new, more modern financial system was needed to fund the state, and more specifically, to fund William's constant wars against his great enemy, Louis XIV of France. The result of this need was nothing short of a financial revolution, a quiet, behind-the-scenes transformation that would have a far greater long-term impact on the world than any battle. The new government, with Parliament now in control of the purse strings, needed a reliable way to borrow money. In the past, the king had borrowed from private financiers and merchant families, but their loans were often unreliable and expensive. To address this, a group of businessmen and financiers, led by the Scottish merchant William Paterson, proposed a revolutionary idea: the creation of a national bank owned by private investors, but with its purpose and structure guaranteed by an act of Parliament. This bank would be able to raise a large sum of money by selling shares, and in return, the government would be able to borrow from it at a much lower interest rate. This new model of public debt, backed by the credit of the entire nation rather than just the monarch, was a massive step forward. A mainstream historical fact is that this was a truly innovative idea, one that would become the model for central banks around the world. And so, in 1694, the Bank of England was founded. It was, in essence, a private company whose primary purpose was to manage the government's debt. The government, for its part, granted the bank a monopoly on issuing notes in London and managing its national debt. The bank quickly became a vital part of the English economy. It provided the government with a steady source of credit, allowing it to fund its military campaigns for years to come. It also helped to stabilize the English currency and provide a more reliable financial system for merchants and traders. The creation of the Bank of England was a direct consequence of the Glorious Revolution. It was a clear example of how the new partnership between Parliament and the monarchy could lead to innovative and effective solutions to national problems. The financial revolution was not just about the creation of a bank. It was about a fundamental shift in the relationship between government and finance. For the first time, the English government was able to borrow money on a large, institutional scale. This allowed it to wage war more effectively, and in the long run, to become the dominant global power of the 18th century. The French, for instance, who relied on the old system of royal finance, were at a distinct disadvantage. Their king could not raise money as easily or as reliably as the English Parliament, and this financial weakness would eventually lead to their defeat in a series of long and costly wars. It's a bit like a modern business. One company has a reliable line of credit and can expand its operations as needed, while the other relies on a series of small, expensive, and unpredictable loans. Which one do you think is going to win in the end? This new financial system also had a profound impact on the political landscape. By creating a national debt, Parliament and the new government were now financially tied to the success of the kingdom. The men who lent money to the government, many of them wealthy merchants and landowners, now had a direct stake in the new political order. They were not going to let a deposed Catholic king come back and repudiate their loans. This created a powerful new constituency that was deeply invested in the success of the Glorious Revolution. It was the financial glue that held the new government together, a solid foundation for the new constitutional monarchy. The revolution had been a political and religious event, but its long-term success was, in many ways, secured by this quiet and perhaps less glorious financial innovation. The Bank of England was the engine that would power the new British Empire. The creation of the Bank of England and the new financial system was not an end in itself. It was a means to an end. For William III, a man who saw Europe through the lens of political and military strategy, the Glorious Revolution was a crucial first step in a much larger project, the containment of King Louis XIV of France. Louis, the self-proclaimed Sun King, was an absolutist monarch who posed a direct threat to the balance of power in Europe and the Protestant world. He was a ruthless expansionist, and he was a Catholic who had given sanctuary to the deposed King James II and his family. For William, the fight against France was a personal and a geopolitical imperative. His successful takeover of England meant he could now bring the full resources of the English navy and army to bear on the French threat. The war that followed was a long, protracted, and brutal affair known as the 9 Years' War, or in England, the War of the Grand Alliance. It was a sprawling conflict that raged across Europe, from the battlefields of Flanders to the colonial frontiers in North America. William, who was a brilliant military strategist, but often unlucky on the battlefield, led his armies in person. He spent most of his reign on campaign, a fact that endeared him to his soldiers, but often left the day-to-day governance of England in the hands of his wife, Queen Mary, and his parliament. This war was a brutal and costly affair, a sharp contrast to the peaceful nature of the revolution that had started it. The English army and navy grew exponentially, and the financial demands of the war were immense. The new financial system, with the Bank of England at its heart, was put to the test, and it passed with flying colors. England was able to outspend and outlast its French rival. The war was a difficult period for the English people. Taxes were high, trade was disrupted, and the casualties were mounting. But it was also a time of intense national pride. They were no longer fighting for a king's personal agenda, but for the defense of their Protestant faith and their hard-won liberties. The war, in a strange way, solidified the new government. It forced the Whigs and Tories, despite their political differences, to work together in a common cause. It also helped to foster a new sense of British identity, a sense of unity against a common French enemy. The war was a constant reminder that the revolution had not been a fluke, but a necessary step to secure their place in the world. While William was away at war, Queen Mary proved to be a capable and intelligent ruler in her own right. She handled the affairs of state with a calm and steady hand, navigating the political landscape of a fractious parliament and a demanding public. She was a popular monarch, and her presence in London provided a sense of continuity and stability while her husband was on the front lines. She was, in many ways, the perfect face for the new monarchy, a link to the old Stuart dynasty, but a firm believer in the new constitutional settlement. Her time as regent was a crucial period in the development of the new government, as it proved that the system could function effectively without the direct, constant presence of the monarch. The War of the Grand Alliance would drag on for nearly a decade, a long, bloody, and often indecisive conflict. It was a war fought not for land, but for power, for the very future of Europe. For William, it was the culmination of his life's work, a grand struggle against absolutism and religious intolerance. He was, in a sense, a professional anti-French king, and the English throne was simply his new, more powerful base of operations. The war was also a proving ground for the new financial system and the new political order. Historians still argue whether William's war was a triumph of geopolitical strategy or a costly and wasteful drain on English resources. But its consequences were clear. It cemented England's place as a major European power. It laid the groundwork for the British Empire, and it forever linked the new constitutional monarchy with the nation's security and prosperity. It was a brutal and unglamorous end to a revolution that had, in its early days, been called glorious. While the 9 Years' War raged on, the English government was undergoing its own quiet, internal revolution. Parliament, which had been so instrumental in bringing William and Mary to power, was determined to ensure that it would never again be sidelined by a monarch. Its members were keen to institutionalize their newfound power and to prevent the king from ruling for long periods without their consent. This political will led to the passing of the Triennial Act in 1694. This seemingly simple piece of legislation was in fact a crucial step in the long march toward a truly representative government. It mandated that Parliament had to be summoned and an election held at least once every 3 years. For centuries, the monarch had the power to call and dismiss Parliament at will. This had given them enormous power, as they could simply dissolve a Parliament that was hostile to their policies and rule by decree. James II had done just that, and his long period of rule without a parliament had been one of the key grievances in the Declaration of Rights. The Triennial Act was a direct response to this abuse of power. It removed the monarch's ability to rule indefinitely without the consent of the people's representatives. It ensured that the government would have to face the electorate on a regular basis, a constant check on royal authority. It was a clear signal that the Glorious Revolution was not just about getting rid of a bad king, but about fundamentally changing the way the country was governed. William, a man who preferred to focus on his European wars, was not initially a fan of the act. He saw it as a constraint on his power and a potential source of political instability. He had, after all, a war to fight, and he did not want to be distracted by constant elections and parliamentary squabbles. But Parliament was insistent. The act was passed with overwhelming support, and William, a pragmatist if nothing else, eventually gave his royal assent. This was a mainstream historical fact, a moment when the will of Parliament prevailed over the will of the monarch, a clear and decisive victory for the new constitutional settlement. The Triennial Act, therefore, not only limited the power of the crown, but also gave Parliament a new sense of purpose and a new kind of power. It transformed Parliament from a temporary assembly called at the king's pleasure into a permanent and indispensable part of the government. The political life of England became a much more dynamic and interesting affair. With regular elections, Political parties, particularly the Whigs and the Tories, began to develop more sophisticated organizations and to campaign more vigorously for the support of the electorate. They were no longer just loose factions in Parliament, but were becoming the modern political parties we recognize today. The debates in Parliament became more public, and the public's interest in politics grew. The press, which had been so important in disseminating information about the revolution, now played a vital role in informing the public about the activities of their representatives. This was a slow, subtle change, but its impact was profound. It was a kind of political evolution, a gentle nudging of the English government toward a more democratic future. The Triennial Act was one of a series of parliamentary acts that together institutionalized the gains of the Glorious Revolution. It was a far cry from the kind of radical democracy that would emerge in later centuries, but for its time, it was a massive step forward. It created a system of checks and balances that would prevent any future monarch from attempting to rule as an absolute sovereign. It ensured that the king or queen, no matter how powerful they might seem, would always have to answer to Parliament. It was a legacy of the Revolution, a constant, gentle reminder that power in England now flowed from the people, not from the crown. This was not a revolution of a day or a year, but a slow, continuous process of change. And the Triennial Act was a pivotal moment in that long and winding story. The fragile political stability of William and Mary's joint reign was shattered by a personal tragedy in late 1694. Queen Mary, a constant and reassuring presence on the home front while her husband was away at war, contracted smallpox. The disease, which had a terrifying mortality rate in the 17th century, moved quickly and mercilessly. Mary, a devoted wife and a popular monarch, was an ideal constitutional queen. She handled Parliament with a gentle but firm hand, and her very presence provided a sense of continuity for those who still felt uneasy about a foreign king on the throne. Her death on December 28, 1694, was a devastating blow to her husband, to the government, and to the nation. William, a man known for his cold and pragmatic demeanor, was heartbroken. The two had a complex relationship that had evolved from a political marriage into a deep and genuine partnership. He was, by all accounts, inconsolable. His health, which had never been robust, began to decline. For the nation, her death was a moment of profound sadness. People wore black armbands, church bells tolled, and London was shrouded in a palpable sense of mourning. Mary had been a popular figure, a Stuart princess who had given up her personal comfort to save her country. Her death, at the young age of 32, was seen by many as a cruel irony. The Glorious Revolution had succeeded, but it had come at a great personal cost. Mary's death also created a political crisis. The Bill of Rights had made no provision for William to rule alone. He had been offered the crown as a joint monarch, and his power was, in theory, tied to his wife's presence on the throne. The question was, what now? Would he have to step down? Would the throne revert to her sister, Princess Anne? Or would the political settlement that had been so carefully crafted simply fall apart? The English Parliament, a body that had proven its political cunning time and again was not about to let all their hard-won gains slip away. They immediately passed an Act of Parliament to confirm William's right to rule alone. It was a swift and decisive action that for a moment put a legal gloss on a very strange situation. It was a clear sign that Parliament, not a monarch, was now the ultimate source of power in England. It was a bit like a legal loophole in reverse. They created a new law to ensure the old arrangement could continue. William, now King William III in his own right, had to navigate a new political reality. He no longer had his wife to soften his image or to act as a buffer between him and a sometimes hostile parliament. He was a foreign-born king who was often seen as a cold and aloof figure. His focus was still on the war with France, and he had little patience for the internal political squabbles of the Whigs and the Tories. The rest of his reign, a period of about 8 years, would be a constant struggle between his desire for strong, centralized authority and Parliament's determination to limit his power. He found himself constantly at odds with his Parliament over matters of finance and foreign policy. They were no longer a frightened assembly, but a confident and assertive body that was keen to exercise its newfound power. Historians still argue whether William's rule after Mary's death was a success or a failure. He won the war against France and cemented England's place as a major European power, but he did so at a great personal and political cost. His relationship with Parliament was often strained, and his popularity with the people never reached the level of his late wife. He was a brilliant strategist and a masterful statesman, but he was not a beloved king. His legacy is therefore a complex one. He was the man who saved England from a Catholic dynasty, but he was also the man who put England on a path toward a long and costly war. He was the king who confirmed the principles of the Glorious Revolution, but he was also the man who constantly tested the limits of those very same principles. His was a story of a reluctant king who was more comfortable on the battlefield than in the halls of power, a man who had won a country but was now struggling to rule it. William III's solo reign after the death of Queen Mary was a constant struggle. He was a king with a European mindset, a man who saw England's role as being part of a larger continent-wide struggle against French absolutism. His primary goal was to win the 9 Years' War and secure a lasting peace. But his parliament, now more powerful and assertive than ever, had a different set of priorities. They were more concerned with domestic affairs, with lowering taxes, and with limiting the size of the standing army. This created a profound and lasting tension between the king and his government, a battle for the soul of the new constitutional monarchy. The political struggles of William's reign were defined by the growing power of Parliament, which was now in control of the nation's finances. The new government had passed a law, the Civil List Act of 1698, which granted William a fixed sum of money for his personal expenses and the running of the royal household. Everything else, the military, the navy, and the war effort, was to be funded by specific parliamentary grants. This was a massive check on the king's power. It meant that he could not simply use the nation's money as he saw fit. He had to come to Parliament, hat in hand, and ask for money for his wars. This gave Parliament enormous leverage, and they used it to great effect. They were not afraid to withhold funds or to demand concessions in return for their support. This new political reality was a constant source of frustration for William. He was a professional soldier who had to constantly negotiate with a group of politicians who often had little understanding of military strategy. He found himself at odds with them on a number of key issues. Parliament, for example, was deeply suspicious of standing armies. They feared that a large professional army could be used by the monarch to crush their liberties and to rule as a tyrant. They repeatedly tried to reduce the size of the army, much to William's annoyance. He, for his part, argued that a large army was necessary to protect England from the French threat. This conflict was a classic example of the new political system at work. It was a constant negotiation, a push and pull between the king's prerogative and Parliament's power. William's reign was also marked by the rise of the political parties, the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs, who had supported the Revolution and believed in the supremacy of Parliament, were generally in favor of the war with France. The Tories, on the other hand, were more skeptical of the war and were more traditional in their support for the monarchy. William, in his pragmatic way, tried to work with both parties, but he found it difficult to maintain a stable government. He often found himself caught in the middle of their political squabbles, a situation that only added to his frustration. It's a bit like a modern-day CEO who has to constantly deal with two warring factions on his board of directors. It's not a recipe for a good night's sleep. Despite these struggles, William's reign was a period of great change and great progress for England. He signed the Treason Act of 1696, which gave defendants the right to be represented by counsel, a major step forward for individual liberties. He oversaw the end of the 9 Years' War with the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, which, though not a decisive victory, did secure England's place as a major European power. He was a man who, despite his personal struggles and his difficult relationship with Parliament, was able to secure the legacy of the Glorious Revolution. He was, in a sense, a professional ruler, a man who was willing to do whatever it took to keep his country safe and to secure the future of the new constitutional monarchy. His reign was a testament to the fact that the English government was now a partnership, a complex and often messy dance between a powerful monarch and an equally powerful parliament. The long-standing issue of succession, which had been the catalyst for the Glorious Revolution, was not fully resolved by the Bill of Rights. That document had only excluded Catholics from the throne, but it had not provided a clear line of succession beyond William and Mary's sister, Princess Anne. This became a matter of urgent national importance, as Anne's own children began to die in infancy or early childhood. By the turn of the 18th century, it was clear that none of Anne's children would survive to adulthood. The last one, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, died in 1700 at the age of 11. His death meant that upon the death of King William III and Princess Anne, the throne would be without a Protestant heir. The prospect of a succession crisis, and with it the possibility of a return of the Catholic Stuart line, loomed large once more. The English Parliament, ever mindful of the chaos and uncertainty of the previous century, was determined to prevent it. And so, in 1701, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement. This was a truly revolutionary piece of legislation, a direct and unequivocal assertion of parliamentary power over the crown. The act settled the succession on the Electress Sophia of Hanover, a granddaughter of King James I and her Protestant descendants. This was a significant moment for a number of reasons. For one, it bypassed more than 50 other potential heirs with closer blood ties to the throne who were for one reason or another Catholic. The act made it clear that religious faith was more important than bloodline when it came to the succession. It was a formal, legal repudiation of the idea of divine right monarchy. The people, through their parliament, were now the ultimate arbiters of who would sit on the throne. The Act of Settlement did more than just settle the succession. It also laid out a number of conditions for the new monarchs, a kind of second Bill of Rights. It stated that all future monarchs must be members of the Church of England. It also required that the monarch could not leave the country without the consent of Parliament, a clear response to William's long absences on the continent. It also made it illegal for foreigners, even those in the royal family, to hold public office or to sit in Parliament. This was a bit of a dig at William's Dutch advisors, a clear sign that the English Parliament wanted to keep the levers of power in English hands. The Act also, for the first time, gave judges a secure tenure, meaning they could not be removed by the monarch at will. This was a crucial step in ensuring the independence of the judiciary, a fundamental principle of modern democracy. The passing of the Act of Settlement was a quiet but profound end to a long-running political drama. It settled the issue of succession once and for all, and it secured the legacy of the Glorious Revolution. It guaranteed that the new Hanoverian dynasty would be a Protestant one, and it enshrined the principle of parliamentary supremacy in law. It was a mainstream historical fact that this act was a fundamental part of the new British Constitution, a document that would define the relationship between the Crown and Parliament for centuries to come. It was a testament to the power of Parliament and a clear sign that the monarchy was now a conditional rather than an absolute institution. The Act of Settlement was the final piece of the legislative puzzle that began with the Declaration of Rights. It was a calm, almost boring bureaucratic solution to a problem that had, in a previous generation, led to a bloody civil war. It was a final triumph of reason over chaos, of law over whim. And with its passing, the story of the Glorious Revolution was for all intents and purposes complete. The new government had not just gotten rid of a king. It had created a new kind of kingdom, a kingdom where the people, through their representatives, had the final say. It was a quiet end to a glorious beginning. The intellectual underpinnings of the Glorious Revolution were as important as its political and military events. While men in Parliament were debating the finer points of law and succession, a great mind was articulating the philosophical principles that would give the revolution its enduring legitimacy. That mind belonged to John Locke, an English philosopher whose ideas on government, liberty, and property would become the intellectual bedrock not just for the Glorious Revolution, but for the Age of Enlightenment itself. Locke's ideas provided a powerful and coherent justification for a people's right to resist a tyrannical ruler and to establish a new government based on consent. Locke's most influential work, Two Treatises of Government, was published in 1689, right in the midst of the revolutionary fervor. The book was a direct response to the political crises of the time. In the first treatise, Locke systematically dismantled the theory of the divine right of kings, a theory that had been the cornerstone of monarchical power for centuries. He argued that no king could claim to have a legitimate right to rule from God or from Adam, the first man. This was a direct assault on the very idea that a monarch's power was unconditional and hereditary. It was, in a sense, a philosophical version of the Bill of Rights. The second treatise was where Locke laid out his own, more positive theory of government. He started with the idea of a state of nature, a time before organized government, where all men were free and equal. In this state, he argued, all men had a natural right to life, liberty, and property. These rights, he argued, were not given to them by a king or a government. They were given by God or by nature itself. This was a radical and revolutionary idea. It meant that a person's rights came before the government's power. It was a complete reversal of the traditional political order, which held that the king was the source of all rights and liberties. Locke went on to argue that people left the state of nature and formed a civil government by a social contract. They agreed to give up some of their freedom in exchange for the protection of their natural rights. But this contract, he argued, was conditional. If the government failed to protect the people's rights, or if it became tyrannical, the people had the right to dissolve that government and create a new one. This was a direct philosophical justification for what the English people had just done to King James II. They had not been rebels or traitors. They had been acting on their natural right to overthrow a government that had violated the social contract. Historians still argue whether Locke's ideas were a cause of the Glorious Revolution or if they were simply a justification for it after the fact. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. His ideas were certainly circulating among the intellectual elite in the years leading up to the revolution, and they provided a powerful language for a people who were tired of royal overreach. His work, in essence, gave the revolution a moral and intellectual authority that it might not have otherwise had. A mainstream historical fact is that Locke's ideas would go on to have an even greater impact across the Atlantic, where they would be read and absorbed by a generation of American revolutionaries. The principles of the American Declaration of Independence, with its famous line about the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, were a direct and powerful echo of Locke's philosophy. The Glorious Revolution had a quiet philosopher working in the background, and his ideas, like a slow-burning fuse, would eventually ignite a much larger global revolution. The Glorious Revolution, though a defining event in English history, was not confined to the shores of Britain. Its effects rippled across the Atlantic, where the English colonies in North America had been watching the events with a mixture of hope and trepidation. For years, the colonists had been subject to King James II's increasingly autocratic rule. He had, like his father and brother before him, attempted to consolidate royal power in the colonies, revoking their charters and imposing a new, centralized administration known as the Dominion of New England. This was a brutal and unpopular move, a clear sign that the king intended to rule the colonies with the same kind of absolute authority he sought in England. The Dominion, under the heavy-handed governorship of Sir Edmund Andros was a source of constant friction and resentment. The colonists, who were used to a greater degree of self-government, saw the Dominion as a violation of their ancient rights and liberties. When news of William's landing in England and James's subsequent flight reached the colonies, it was met with a surge of relief and excitement. The colonists, many of whom were Puritans who had fled religious persecution in England, saw William as their liberator. They saw his invasion not as an act of foreign aggression, but as a providential act, a divine intervention to save their religion and their way of life. The news was a match to a tinderbox, and a series of smaller colonial revolutions erupted. In Boston, a well-organized mob, led by prominent local leaders, seized and arrested Governor Andros and other officials of the Dominion of New England. They restored the old charter and declared their loyalty to William and Mary. In New York, a rebellion led by a German merchant named Jacob Leisler overthrew the royal government and set up a new one in the name of the new monarchs. And in Maryland, Protestants seized control of the government from the Catholic proprietor, Lord Baltimore. These were not just isolated acts of rebellion. They were a direct and powerful echo of the Revolution in England. These colonial revolts were, in many ways, a miniature version of the Glorious Revolution. They were a revolt against a tyrannical government, a defense of local liberties, and a triumph of Protestantism over Catholicism. But they were also different. Unlike in England, the American colonists were not just fighting for a change of monarchs. They were fighting for the restoration of their old charters and their old way of life. They were fighting for the right to govern themselves. For them, the revolution was not just about limiting the power of the king, it was about limiting the power of the government, period. This was a subtle but profound difference. It was a step on the road toward a new kind of political thought, one that would eventually lead to a more complete separation from the mother country. The Glorious Revolution also had a long-term impact on the way the British Empire was governed. The new government in England, with Parliament now in control, was more willing to give the colonies a greater degree of autonomy. They saw the colonies not just as a source of wealth, but as a vital part of the British political and economic system, while the Navigation Acts, which regulated colonial trade, remained in place. The new government was less inclined to interfere in the day-to-day affairs of the colonies. This period of salutary neglect would allow the colonies to grow and develop their own unique political and social identities, a process that would eventually lead to their independence a century later. Historians still argue whether the colonial revolts of 1689 were a triumph of liberty or a triumph of factional interests, a reflection of a deep-seated desire for self-government, or simply a way for local elites to grab power. The reality is that it was probably a bit of both, but the consequence was clear. The Glorious Revolution had fundamentally changed the relationship between England and its colonies. It had provided them with a powerful example of a successful revolt against tyranny, and it had given them a new, more powerful voice in their own affairs. It was a quiet, almost forgotten chapter of the Glorious Revolution, but it was a crucial one, a foreshadowing of the great drama that would one day unfold across the sea. The Glorious Revolution is often called bloodless, a nickname that, as we have seen, is only partially true. While the English part of the Revolution was largely free of large-scale military conflict, the war in Ireland and Scotland was a brutal and bloody affair. However, the term Glorious Revolution itself was not one that was used at the time. It was a retrospective name, a title bestowed by later historians who wanted to emphasize its positive outcome and its contrast to the chaos and bloodshed of the English Civil War. The term first appeared in the late 17th century, but didn't become widely used until the mid-18th century, a time when the new constitutional monarchy was seen as a source of great stability and prosperity. The name Glorious Revolution was a brilliant piece of historical branding. It was a way of looking back at a messy, confusing, and often frightening event and giving it a clean, positive meaning. It reframed the rebellion against a legitimate king not as an act of treason, but as a providential act, a great national moment when liberty and Protestantism were saved from the twin threats of absolutism and Catholicism. It allowed the English to feel a sense of national pride in a revolution that was in reality a bit of a mixed bag. Historians still argue whether the name is an accurate description of the events or a piece of deliberate political mythology. The reality is that it was probably a bit of both. It was a revolution that was glorious in its outcome, but not always in its execution. The name, Glorious Revolution, also served a political purpose. It helped to legitimize the new regime of William and Mary. By calling it a glorious event, a great moment in English history, the new government was able to downplay the more controversial aspects of its rise to power. It was a way of saying, this was not a foreign invasion, this was a national salvation. It was a powerful and effective way to secure the loyalty of a people who were in many ways still deeply attached to the idea of a hereditary monarchy. The name also created a sense of a shared national identity, a sense of a people who had come together to defend their liberties against a common enemy. It was a way of telling a story about the revolution, a story that was, in many ways, more important than the events themselves. The revolution's bloodless reputation therefore comes from this historical framing. The fact that William's invasion and his march on London were met with little to no resistance was a major departure from the norms of a traditional military conquest. There were no great battles, no sieges of the city, and no mass executions. The transfer of power was, for the most part, a peaceful and orderly affair. This was a profound and lasting legacy of the Revolution. It set a precedent for future political change in England. It showed that it was possible to change the government without resorting to the kind of large-scale violence that had characterized the Civil War. It was, in a sense, a lesson in political maturity. The name Glorious Revolution also hides the fact that the revolution was, in many ways, a profoundly conservative one. It was not a revolution that sought to overthrow the social order or to create a new, radical form of government. It was a revolution that sought to restore the old one, to put the king back in his proper place, and to re-establish the traditional balance of power between the crown and parliament. It was a revolution that was, in the words of some historians, a rebellion in the name of the law. The new government did not seek to invent new rights. It sought to reaffirm the old ones. It was a conservative triumph a victory for the idea that the English Constitution was an ancient and sacred thing that had to be protected at all costs. It was not a revolution of a mob, but a revolution of an elite. It was not a revolution of a people, but a revolution of a parliament. And for that, perhaps, it was truly glorious. With the political dust settled and the new constitutional order firmly in place, the English government and its people began to settle into a new and unfamiliar reality. The Glorious Revolution was not a single event, but a new state of being, a new relationship between the crown and parliament. The long, bloody saga of a power struggle that had defined the 17th century was for the most part over. The idea of an absolute monarch was gone, replaced by a system of limited government, parliamentary supremacy, and the rule of law. It was a subtle, almost quiet shift, but its effects were profound and long-lasting. The period that followed, the 18th century, would be one of unprecedented stability and growth for England, and it was all built on the foundation of 1688. The new political reality was a partnership. The king or queen was no longer a solitary figure of power, but a partner in a great enterprise with Parliament. The monarchs still held a great deal of power. They could veto legislation, declare war, and appoint ministers. But they had to do so with the consent of Parliament, and Parliament, for its part, was now a permanent and indispensable part of the government. It controlled the nation's finances, it passed the laws, and it held the monarch accountable. It was a system of checks and balances, a delicate dance of power that for the most part worked. This was a mainstream historical fact, a new model of government that was unique in the world at the time. While other European nations were still ruled by absolute monarchs, England was quietly and peacefully evolving into a constitutional monarchy. This new political stability had a number of positive effects. It allowed the English economy to flourish. The new government, with its reliable financial system and its respect for property rights, created an environment that was conducive to trade and commerce. The Bank of England provided the capital needed for new ventures, and the stability of the government encouraged investment. The result was a period of rapid economic growth, a period that would eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution. This was not a coincidence. The political stability of the Glorious Revolution was a key ingredient in the economic success of the 18th century. It gave merchants, traders, and entrepreneurs the confidence to invest their money, knowing that their property would be safe from the arbitrary whims of a king. The new government also led to a period of great intellectual and cultural flourishing. The Bill of Rights and the Toleration Act created a more open and tolerant society. While religious persecution did not disappear overnight, the new laws did create a space for intellectual and religious dissent. The coffee houses of London, for example, which had been centers of political gossip and debate, became even more important. They were places where people of all social classes and all political opinions could come together and discuss the great issues of the day. This was a time of great public discourse, a time when new ideas, from John Locke's political philosophy to Isaac Newton's scientific theories, could be discussed and debated freely. The Glorious Revolution, in a sense, created the conditions for the Age of Enlightenment in England. It was a kind of political and intellectual spring, a long-awaited thaw after a century of turmoil and conflict. Of course, the new system was not perfect. The government was still dominated by a small, wealthy elite, and the vast majority of the population had no say in who governed them. The poor still lived in poverty, and the laws were often harsh and unforgiving. But for its time, it was a massive step forward. It was a system that, while imperfect, was based on the idea of law and liberty, not on the whim of a king. It was a system that, for all its faults, was a model for other nations to follow. The Glorious Revolution had not just changed a king, it had changed the very nature of government itself. It was the end of a long, difficult journey and the beginning of a new one, a journey toward a more stable, more prosperous, and more free society. The enduring legacy of the Glorious Revolution is a complex tapestry, a series of interconnected threads that, when woven together, tell the story of a new kind of government. The revolution was, in many ways, an experiment, a grand political improvisation that, against all odds, worked. It was the moment that fundamentally altered the relationship between the Crown and Parliament, setting the stage for the modern British state. But its legacy is not just about institutions and laws. It is also about ideas, about the slow, quiet triumph of liberty and reason over absolutism and religious zealotry. One of the most important aspects of this legacy was the creation of a constitutional monarchy. The Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement were not just legal documents, they were a new social contract. They established the principle that the monarch's power was limited by law, and that their right to rule came not from God, but from the consent of the people as represented by Parliament. This was a profound shift in political thought, one that would have a massive influence on other nations. It was a model for a stable, peaceful, and prosperous government, one that balanced the need for a strong executive with the need for individual liberties. The revolution also cemented the principle of parliamentary supremacy. The monarch could no longer suspend laws, raise taxes, or maintain a standing army without the consent of Parliament. Parliament became the true center of power, a body that controlled the nation's finances and, in effect, held the monarch accountable. This was a direct result of the long, arduous struggle of the 17th century, a struggle that had finally ended in a clear victory for the representatives of the people. This newfound power would allow Parliament to pass a series of landmark laws that would shape the future of the nation, from the Triennial Act to the Act of Settlement. It was a quiet, bureaucratic revolution that in its own way was just as important as the more dramatic events on the battlefield. The Glorious Revolution also had a major impact on the rule of law. The Bill of Rights, with its protections for individual liberties and its demands for an independent judiciary, was a crucial step on the road toward a more just and fair society. It established the principle that no one, not even the king, was above the law. This was a powerful idea, one that would be absorbed by later generations and become a cornerstone of modern democracy. It was the idea that a government's power was not absolute, but was limited by a series of checks and balances, and that the rights of the individual were sacred and inviolable. And finally, the Glorious Revolution was a victory for Protestantism, and more specifically, for the Anglican Church. The revolution was, in many ways, a religious one, a popular revolt against the twin threats of Catholicism and absolutism. The Bill of Rights, with its exclusion of Catholics from the throne, was a clear and unequivocal statement that the nation would forever be a Protestant one. The Toleration Act, with its grant of freedom to Protestant dissenters, was a recognition that a diverse society was a stable one. It was a compromise, to be sure, but it was a step toward a more tolerant society, a society that, for all its faults, was more open and more free than the one that came before it. The legacy of the Glorious Revolution is, in a sense, the legacy of all these things, a quiet and bloodless revolution that in its own way changed the world forever. The Glorious Revolution and its new political settlement created a new kind of England, but it was a quiet evolution, not a radical break with the past. The country was, for the first time, governed by a new kind of partnership, a partnership between a powerful monarch and an equally powerful parliament. This new political reality was not just a legal abstraction, it was a daily reality, a subtle change that shaped everything from foreign policy to domestic life. For the first time, England had a system of government that was both stable and free, a delicate balance that would serve as a model for future nations. The new system was, at its heart, a compromise. The monarchy, for instance, had been preserved. The English people were not ready for a republic, and the horrors of the English Civil War were still fresh in their minds. But the monarchy that was restored was a different kind of monarchy. It was a monarchy that ruled with the consent of the people, a monarchy that was subject to the law, and a monarchy that was, for all intents and purposes, a constitutional one. William and Mary and their successors were kings and queens, but they were not absolute sovereigns. They were not above the law. They were a part of it. The monarchy had been saved from itself, and it was stronger for it. Parliament, for its part, had been transformed. It was no longer a temporary assembly called at the king's pleasure. It was a permanent and indispensable part of the government. It controlled the nation's finances, it passed the laws, and it held the monarch accountable. This newfound power had a number of positive effects. It led to a more responsive government, a government that was more in tune with the needs of the people. It also led to a more stable government. The power struggles of the past, between a king who wanted to rule absolutely and a parliament that wanted to limit his power, were now settled. The new system, while not perfect, was a way to resolve those disputes peacefully and within the law. The revolution also had a profound impact on the English people themselves. The Bill of Rights, with its guarantees of individual liberties, created a new kind of citizen, a citizen who had rights that were protected by law, not by the whim of a monarch. The Toleration Act, with its grant of freedom to Protestant dissenters, created a more open and tolerant society. While religious persecution did not disappear overnight, the new laws did create a space for intellectual and religious dissent. This was a crucial step on the road toward a more free and open society, a society that would eventually lead to the great intellectual and cultural flourishing of the 18th century. The Glorious Revolution was not a single event. It was a process, a slow, quiet, and deliberate journey toward a new kind of government. It was a process that, for all its faults, was a triumph of reason and a testament to the power of a people who, when pushed to the brink, were able to find a peaceful and lasting solution to a profound political crisis. It was a revolution that in its quiet way changed the world forever. The story of the Glorious Revolution is a story about a people who were able to learn from their past and to build a new and better future. The enduring legacy of the Glorious Revolution is a complex tapestry, a series of interconnected threads that, when woven together, tell the story of a new kind of government. The revolution was, in many ways, an experiment, a grand political improvisation that, against all odds, worked. It was the moment that fundamentally altered the relationship between the Crown and Parliament, setting the stage for the modern British state. But its legacy is not just about institutions and laws. It is also about ideas, about the slow, quiet triumph of liberty and reason over absolutism and religious zealotry. One of the most important aspects of this legacy was the creation of a constitutional monarchy. The Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement were not just legal documents, they were a new social contract. They established the principle that the monarch's power was limited by law, and that their right to rule came not from God, but from the consent of the people as represented by Parliament. This was a profound shift in political thought, one that would have a massive influence on other nations. It was a model for a stable, peaceful, and prosperous government, one that balanced the need for a strong executive with the need for individual liberties. The revolution also cemented the principle of parliamentary supremacy. The monarch could no longer suspend laws, raise taxes, or maintain a standing army without the consent of Parliament. Parliament became the true center of power, a body that controlled the nation's finances and, in effect, held the monarch accountable. This was a direct result of the long, arduous struggle of the 17th century, a struggle that had finally ended in a clear victory for the representatives of the people. This newfound power would allow Parliament to pass a series of landmark laws that would shape the future of the nation, from the Triennial Act to the Act of Settlement. It was a quiet, bureaucratic revolution that in its own way was just as important as the more dramatic events on the battlefield. The Glorious Revolution also had a major impact on the rule of law. The Bill of Rights, with its protections for individual liberties and its demands for an independent judiciary, was a crucial step on the road toward a more just and fair society. It established the principle that no one, not even the king, was above the law. This was a powerful idea, one that would be absorbed by later generations and become a cornerstone of modern democracy. It was the idea that a government's power was not absolute, but was limited by a series of checks and balances, and that the rights of the individual were sacred and inviolable. And finally, the Glorious Revolution was a victory for Protestantism, and more specifically, for the Anglican Church. The revolution was, in many ways, a religious one, a popular revolt against the twin threats of Catholicism and absolutism. The Bill of Rights, with its exclusion of Catholics from the throne, was a clear and unequivocal statement that the nation would forever be a Protestant one. The Toleration Act, with its grant of freedom to Protestant dissenters, was a recognition that a diverse society was a stable one. It was a compromise, to be sure, but it was a step toward a more tolerant society, a society that, for all its faults, was more open and more free than the one that came before it. The legacy of the Glorious Revolution is, in a sense, the legacy of all these things, a quiet and bloodless revolution that in its own way changed the world forever. While the Glorious Revolution was a triumph of reason and law, it was also a story of a long and often difficult transition. The new political order had to prove its worth, and its first major test came with the death of King William III in 1702. William, who had been a constant presence on the battlefield and in the halls of power, was gone. His death, after a fall from his horse, once again threw the issue of succession into the spotlight. According to the Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement, the throne passed to his sister-in-law, Princess Anne. She was the last of the Stuart line, and her reign would be a crucial period in the consolidation of the new constitutional monarchy. Anne was a devout Anglican and a popular queen, but she was a far cry from her predecessor. She was a woman of frail health, with a quiet and private nature. She had little interest in the grand military campaigns that had defined William's reign, and was more focused on domestic policy and the affairs of the church. Her reign was a testament to the fact that the new system could work even with a monarch who was not a brilliant military commander or a shrewd political strategist. The power of the crown was now so limited by law that a less ambitious monarch could still be an effective one. This was a crucial test of the new system, and it passed with flying colors. The government continued to function, and the nation continued to prosper. Anne's reign was a period of great political and military success. Under her leadership, the English, now in a formal union with the Scots to form the new kingdom of Great Britain, won a series of stunning victories in the War of the Spanish Succession. This was a major European conflict that once again pitted the British against their old enemy, France. The British army, led by the brilliant Duke of Marlborough, a man who had famously abandoned James II during the Glorious Revolution, won a series of stunning victories at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde. These victories cemented Britain's place as a major European power and ensured that the new constitutional monarchy was a military force to be reckoned with. The war was also a testament to the power of the new financial system. The Bank of England provided the government with the funds it needed to fight a long and costly war, and the British economy, fueled by trade and commerce, was able to outspend its French rival. It's a bit like a sports team that has a great new coach and a deep bench of talented players. They may have had a few losses in the past, but now they are a winning team, and everyone knows it. However, Anne's reign was not without its political struggles. The Whigs and the Tories, who had been working together to fight the war, now found themselves at odds over the terms of the peace treaty. The Whigs, who were more pro-war, wanted to continue the fight until France was completely defeated. The Tories, who were more anti-war, wanted to make peace and end the costly conflict. The political infighting was intense, and it was a clear sign that the new system was a work in progress, but it was also a sign of its strength. The political battles were now fought in the halls of Parliament, not on the battlefield. The government was no longer a single, unified force, but a coalition of competing interests, and the Queen, as a constitutional monarch, had to navigate a complex political landscape. Anne's quiet, steady hand and her willingness to work with Parliament were a crucial part of the process. The end of Anne's reign was also a moment of great political tension. She had no surviving children, and the issue of succession once again loomed large. The Act of Settlement had settled the succession on the Hanoverian dynasty, but there were still many who secretly longed for a return of the Stuart line. The Jacobites, as they were known, were a constant source of fear and anxiety for the new government. They believed that the Glorious Revolution had been an illegal act, and that the only legitimate king was James II and his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, who was now living in exile in France. When Anne died in 1714, a quiet coup was executed by a few influential politicians to ensure a smooth and peaceful transition to the new monarch's George, the Elector of Hanover. It was a testament to the power of the new system that the transition was a peaceful one, a clear sign that the revolution had truly succeeded. The long, messy, and often violent saga of the 17th century was over, and the new era of constitutional monarchy had begun. The succession of the Hanoverian dynasty to the British throne in 1714 marked a significant moment in the life of the Glorious Revolution. The new king, George VI, was a German prince who spoke very little English. He was a constitutional monarch, but he was a monarch who was in many ways an outsider. He had no real interest in the day-to-day politics of the British government, preferring to spend his time in Hanover. This had a profound and lasting effect on the development of the British government. With the king so detached from the political life of the nation, the power of the prime minister and the cabinet began to grow. Robert Walpole, who served as prime minister for over 2 decades, was the first to truly harness this new reality. He was, in effect, the first modern prime minister, a man who was responsible for the day-to-day running of the government. This was a direct and powerful legacy of the Glorious Revolution. It was a clear sign that the government was no longer run by the king, but by a powerful group of ministers who were responsible to Parliament. The new Hanoverian dynasty was, for a time, a fragile one. The Jacobites, who believed in the divine right of the Stuarts to rule, were a constant source of trouble. They mounted a series of rebellions in 1715 and 1745, and while they were ultimately unsuccessful, they were a clear reminder that the political settlement of 1688 was not universally accepted. The Jacobite rebellions were a last gasp of the old monarchical order, a final attempt to restore the kind of absolute monarchy that had been so soundly rejected by the Glorious Revolution. Their defeat at the Battle of Culloden in 1746 was the final bloody end to their cause. It was a brutal and a decisive victory for the new Hanoverian government, a clear sign that the old order was truly dead and gone. The Glorious Revolution had, in a sense, created a new kind of political culture, one that was based on the idea of political parties and parliamentary government. The Whigs and the Tories, who had been a part of the political landscape for decades, now became the dominant forces in British politics. They were no longer just loose factions, but were becoming the organized, disciplined political parties we recognize today. They fought over everything from foreign policy to religious toleration, and their battles were fought not on the battlefield, but in the halls of Parliament and in the pages of the press. This was a crucial step on the road toward modern democracy. It was a clear sign that political power in Britain was no longer a matter of royal whim, but a matter of public debate and political negotiation. The new political reality also had a profound impact on the relationship between Britain and its colonies. The period of salutary neglect, which had begun under William and Mary, continued under the Hanoverians. The British government, preoccupied with its wars in Europe and its domestic political struggles, had little time to interfere in the day-to-day affairs of the colonies. This allowed the colonies to grow and develop their own political and economic institutions. They became, in effect, miniature versions of the British state, with their own assemblies and their own local governments. This was a crucial period in the development of the American colonies, a period that would eventually lead to their independence a century later. The Glorious Revolution had, in a quiet and often subtle way, changed the world forever. It had provided a model for a stable, peaceful, and prosperous government, one that was based on the idea of liberty and the rule of law. It had created a new kind of political culture, one that was based on the idea of political parties and parliamentary government. It had, in a sense, laid the groundwork for the modern democratic state. The story of the Glorious Revolution is a story about a people who were able to learn from their past and to build a new and better future. The final and perhaps most subtle legacy of the Glorious Revolution was its profound influence on the way history itself was written. The events of 1688 were not just a series of facts, they were a story, a narrative that was carefully crafted to give meaning and legitimacy to the new political order. The Whig historians of the 18th and 19th centuries, who were the intellectual heirs of the Revolution, were the ones who truly solidified its reputation as a glorious event. They saw the Revolution as the culmination of a long, centuries-old struggle between the forces of liberty, represented by Parliament, and the forces of tyranny, represented by the Crown. In their telling, the Revolution was not a radical break with the past, but a return to ancient English liberties that had been trampled on by a series of power-hungry monarchs. This narrative was a powerful one, and it would dominate the way the Revolution was taught and understood for centuries to come. This interpretation, however, has not gone unchallenged. In the 20th century, a new generation of historians began to question the glorious nature of the Revolution. They pointed to the violence in Ireland and Scotland, to the exclusion of Catholics from political life, and to the fact that the Revolution was, in many ways, an act of a small, wealthy elite, not a popular uprising. They argued that the Revolution was less a triumph of liberty and more a triumph of a particular class and a particular religious group. They pointed out that the Revolution did not lead to a modern democracy, but to a constitutional monarchy where political power was still concentrated in the hands of a few. This debate between the Whig and revisionist historians is still ongoing, and it is a clear sign that the legacy of the Glorious Revolution is a complex and contested one. Historians still argue about whether the Glorious Revolution was a truly revolutionary event or a conservative one. On the one hand, it was revolutionary in its outcome. It fundamentally changed the relationship between the Crown and Parliament and it established the principle of parliamentary supremacy. It was a decisive break with the idea of a divine right monarchy. On the other hand, it was deeply conservative in its goals. The revolutionaries were not trying to invent a new form of government. They were trying to restore an old one, to put the king back in his proper place, and to reaffirm the ancient liberties of the English people. They were, in many ways, looking backward, not forward. This paradox is at the heart of the Glorious Revolution. It was a revolution that was both a triumph of new ideas and a reaffirmation of old ones. It was a revolution that in its own way was able to change the world by looking to the past. The enduring legacy of the Glorious Revolution is therefore a story of a paradox. It was a revolution that, for all its faults, was able to create a new, more stable, and more free society. It was a revolution that was able to change the very nature of government without resorting to the kind of large-scale violence that had characterized the English Civil War. It was a revolution that in its quiet way provided a model for future nations, a model for a government that was both strong and free, a model for a society that was both stable and open. The story of the Glorious Revolution is a story of a people who, when faced with a profound political crisis, were able to find a peaceful and lasting solution. It is a story that, for all its complexity and all its controversy, is still worth telling. The story of the Glorious Revolution, for all its grand political and military drama, has a quiet aftermath. After the tumultuous events of 1688 and 1689, a new political reality settled over the British Isles, a reality that was a direct result of the Revolution's many compromises and innovations. The period that followed was not one of great upheaval, but one of slow, steady consolidation. The new constitutional monarchy, with its delicate balance of power, proved to be remarkably stable and durable. It was a new kind of government, a partnership that for the most part worked. The king and the parliament, once sworn enemies, now found themselves bound together in a great enterprise, the governance of the nation. This new reality was a fundamental break with the past, a clear sign that the old, absolutist ways were gone forever. The old idea of a king who ruled by divine right was dead, replaced by the idea of a king who ruled with the consent of the people, as represented by their parliament. The revolution had also ushered in a new kind of political culture, one that was based on the idea of public debate and political parties. The coffee houses of London, which had been so important in spreading the news of the revolution, now became centers of political discussion and debate. The press, which had been freed from royal censorship by the revolution, now played a vital role in informing the public about the activities of their representatives. This was a crucial step on the road toward modern democracy. It was a clear sign that political power in Britain was no longer a matter of royal whim, but a matter of public opinion and political negotiation. The political battles were now fought in the halls of Parliament and in the pages of the press, not on the battlefield. This was a new and much healthier way to resolve the nation's political disputes. The revolution also had a profound and lasting impact on the nation's financial system. The creation of the Bank of England had been a direct result of the revolution, and it was a crucial step in the development of a modern, stable, and prosperous economy. The new government, with its reliable financial system, was able to fund its wars, promote trade, and encourage investment. This was a major advantage over its European rivals, who were still stuck in the old, royal-centered financial system. The financial revolution was in many ways just as important as the political one. It was the engine that would power the new British Empire, and it was a direct and powerful legacy of the Glorious Revolution. This new political and economic reality also had a profound impact on the nation's identity. The revolution had, in a sense, created a new kind of Englishness, an identity that was based on the idea of liberty, Protestantism, and a respect for the rule of law. The English people were no longer just the subjects of a king. They were the citizens of a free and prosperous nation. The revolution had, in its own way, created a new sense of national pride, a sense of a people who had come together to defend their liberties against a common enemy. It was a quiet and often subtle change, but its effects were profound and long-lasting. It was the end of a long, messy, and often violent century, and the beginning of a new one, a century that would be one of unprecedented stability and growth for Britain. The Glorious Revolution was a story of a nation that, when faced with a profound political crisis, was able to find a peaceful and lasting solution. It was a story of a people who were able to learn from their past and to build a new and better future. And it was a story that, for all its complexity and all its controversy, is still worth telling. It is a story of a revolution that was truly glorious. The final and most enduring legacy of the Glorious Revolution is a quiet one, a subtle but profound shift in the very soul of the British nation. The long, bloody saga of a power struggle that had defined the 17th century was for the most part over. The old order, with its belief in the divine right of kings and the absolute power of the monarch, was gone forever. In its place, a new reality had emerged, a new kind of government that was both stable and free. It was a partnership, a delicate dance of power between a limited monarch and a supreme parliament. This new political reality was a fundamental break with the past, a quiet and often subtle triumph of liberty and reason over absolutism and religious zealotry. The old idea of a king who ruled by divine right was dead, replaced by the idea of a king who ruled with the consent of the people as represented by their parliament. The revolution had also ushered in a new kind of political culture, one that was based on the idea of public debate and political parties. The coffee houses of London, which had been so important in spreading the news of the revolution, now became centers of political discussion and debate. The press, which had been freed from royal censorship by the revolution, now played a vital role in informing the public about the activities of their representatives. This was a crucial step on the road toward modern democracy. It was a clear sign that political power in Britain was no longer a matter of royal whim, but a matter of public opinion and political negotiation. The political battles were now fought in the halls of Parliament and in the pages of the press, not on the battlefield. This was a new and much healthier way to resolve the nation's political disputes. The revolution also had a profound and lasting impact on the nation's financial system. The creation of the Bank of England had been a direct result of the revolution, and it was a crucial step in the development of a modern, stable, and prosperous economy. The new government, with its reliable financial system, was able to fund its wars, promote trade, and encourage investment. This was a major advantage over its European rivals, who were still stuck in the old, royal-centered financial system. The financial revolution was in many ways just as important as the political one. It was the engine that would power the new British Empire, and it was a direct and powerful legacy of the Glorious Revolution. This new political and economic reality also had a profound impact on the nation's identity. The revolution had, in a sense, created a new kind of Englishness, an identity that was based on the idea of liberty, Protestantism, and a respect for the rule of law. The English people were no longer just the subjects of a king. They were the citizens of a free and prosperous nation. The revolution had, in its own way, created a new sense of national pride, a sense of a people who had come together to defend their liberties against a common enemy. It was a quiet and often subtle change, but its effects were profound and long-lasting. It was the end of a long, messy, and often violent century, and the beginning of a new one, a century that would be one of unprecedented stability and growth for Britain. The Glorious Revolution was a story of a nation that, when faced with a profound political crisis, was able to find a peaceful and lasting solution. It was a story of a people who were able to learn from their past and to build a new and better future. And so, the sun sets on this story of a revolution that was truly glorious. The echoes of its victory can still be heard in the quiet halls of Westminster, in the solemn language of the law, and in the enduring belief that a government of the people, for the people, is the only one worth having. The long journey is now over, and all that is left is the gentle silence that follows a story well told. End of script. Sweet dreams.